Rain poured steadily over the towering manor, its stone walls glistening under the gray sky. A faint shaft of light slipped through a high window into a vast chamber where a small cradle rested. Inside, a newborn child lay swaddled, his quiet breaths drowned by the patter of rain. An elderly man stood over the cradle, as if regarding some unwanted parcel delivered to the wrong address. This was the child's father, and the look on his face spoke clearly enough. This birth was not a blessing, but an inconvenience. His displeasure had a name: Kajin. The boy's cousin had been born at the exact same hour, a child blessed by the sword god Keshak, with talent etched into his very bones. The contrast was cruel. As the boy's mother cradled him, her gaze carried the same unspoken wish, if only this had been Kajin. It did not take long for the boy to learn why their disappointment ran so deep. He had been born without a right arm. Night after night, his mother would murmur softly to him, asking if he could not simply fade away and spare them the trouble. She still called him my baby. But the sweetness never reached her eyes. He would have apologized if he could, though he wasn't about to leave life so soon. He remembered hearing his father speak while he was still in her womb, grand talk of hope, though even then laced with irritation. His father's ambition was simple: to see his child outshine his older brothers. That dream fractured the moment the boy's condition was revealed. No divine blessing, no right arm, and no future worth boasting about. Years passed, and in the courtyard, Kajin played under the watchful eye of servants, his movements light and graceful, already walking with confidence, while the boy could barely rise to his feet. By the time the boy had managed his first shaky steps, Kajin was already holding a blade. The comparisons never ceased. By the time he picked up a weapon, his mother was still displeased, as Kajin could already sense mana and had begun training in the Samyeon sword arts. She even mused aloud that Kajin should have been her son instead. For the boy, admiration and resentment tangled tightly. When he was 7, his father sent him to serve as one of Kajin's attendants. The official story was that he was to be a companion and helper to his cousin. Though the truth was uglier, he had been sold for 3,000 luden. One day, he found himself tied to a tree, the whip slashing across his body. Kajin's voice was sharp with mockery, declaring he had never met a loser quite like him. From the beginning, Kajin's dislike was a given. The boy, Davin, learned to hold his tears, and not because of the pain, but because every adult in the manor pretended not to see. His uncle, once a respected man, had long since vanished, leaving no one to check Kajin's arrogance. The blessed cousin became a ruffian, bullying anyone who dared oppose him, and even those who surrendered received beatings for sport. He wasn't done, though. Kajin called for Davin. He was to be the next victim. Jealousy burned in Davin's chest, not of Kajin's cruelty, but of his skill. He wanted to be strong, too. He charged, knowing the outcome was already decided. Kajin met him with the ease of someone who had never known defeat. Stepping on him, Kajin sneered that hard work could never match his talent. Davin still clung to the belief that effort might one day bridge the gap. He trained hard while Kajin played around, but even then, whenever they clashed, Kajin was superior. Years later, that belief met its test in the arena. Kajin's strikes were relentless, his movements sharp as lightning. Davin dodged until, with sudden precision, he blurred Kajin's vision and closed the distance. A strike, a punch, and an explosion of force left the crowd stunned. Against all odds, the one-armed man had beaten the storm sword of the Samyeon family. It had taken 21 official matches, 24 losses, and countless humiliations. But at 29 years old, Davin had finally won. Kajin's fury was immediate. He spat that losing to a man like Davin was unthinkable. The insults Davin had heard his whole life echoed in his mind. If only you were Kajin, if only Kajin were my son. Calmly, Davin told him that if he were Kajin, he would have used his talent for something meaningful instead of drowning it in wine and vice. For a moment, it seemed the feud had ended. Davin walked off, pleased with himself. But then suddenly, Kajin struck from behind, stabbing him before the stunned crowd. The blade was Sunblade, the Samyeon heirloom, laced with anti-magic. Survival was impossible without a miracle. As darkness closed in, Davin used his last breath to tell Kajin he would be remembered as the true loser. When he next opened his eyes, he was tied to a chair in an underground chamber. A masked stranger stood before him, remarking on his luck. Who would have guessed that Saint Layla herself had been in the arena? Her healing had dragged him back from the brink. though his body remained broken. The stranger then asked whether he had made a pact with the devil. Before Davin could react, the man continued, claiming his parents had admitted as much already. According to this tale, bottles of blood and sacrificial remains had been found in his home, evidence, they said, of a contract that had granted him the strength to defeat Kajin at the cost of 300 innocent children. The family declared Kajin's act a noble defense of Samyan honor. Davin laughed bitterly, realizing he had won against Kajin, but not against the Samyan name. For this alleged crime, his limbs were severed, his mana sealed under heavy chains, and he was dragged into the family's prison. Even his eyes were bound. One day, Kajin himself visited, smirking that Davin looked quite fitting in chains. He claimed the title of Sword Emperor and thanked Davin, mocking him for paving the way. After Kajin left, Davin's rations were cut and his body weakened further. Starving, he thought of how he had wished to die with honor in the arena. He wondered if things would have been different had he been born whole or blessed, or of the direct line. He did not want to die, but choice had long since left his hands. His thoughts began to fade, until a bright light bloomed before him, and unfamiliar sounds stirred the air. Davin found himself hearing a voice that asked whether he was even listening while an adult of the family was speaking to him. And then, quite suddenly, he woke. Someone was calling out to him. The sensation of pain lingered, curiously focused on his right arm, a detail his mind quietly filed under impossible, yet somehow convincing. Standing before him was an adult from one of the Adenka branch families, a face oddly familiar in the way a half-forgotten childhood acquaintance might be. The man addressed him as Vinchin, the seventh son of the Adenka family. Davin, who up until a moment ago had been fairly certain his name was not Vinchin, felt the dissonance settle like fog in his head. The memories that came with that name were unwelcome, but oddly tolerable, especially compared to the musky stench of the Samyan family's underground prison. In this strange new reality, the air was fresh, his body had a right arm, and the thought crossed his mind that perhaps this was some final indulgence granted to him before death. The man spoke again, using a faint pulse of mana, to demand how long Vinchin planned on ignoring him. The intent was clear. He used pain as a method to intimidate him. Vinchin, or rather Davin in Vinchin's body, instinctively caught the man's hand, stopping the attack. Without hesitation, he slammed his palm into the man's chest, sending a ripple of shock across the man's face and his body across the room, an expression Davin privately found quite satisfying. The man recovered with a cold declaration that his own son would crush Vinchin mercilessly in the upcoming Assembly of Two Swords, making history as the first branch family to best the main family. Davin noticed the man's fixation. Much like Davin's own father had once done, this man had abandoned his own ambitions and shoved them wholesale onto his child. The man left in clear frustration. Left alone, Davin sat and tried to sort his thoughts. This did not feel like a dream. Dreams didn't last this long. Then more memories surfaced. Vinchin's mother had died giving birth to him. His father's interest in him was non-existent, and his siblings treated him as a convenient scapegoat. And among the 8 children of Adenka, the 7th son Vinchin was a coward in the truest sense, someone who would retreat to his room and cry after being slapped by even the youngest sibling. In the main family, Vinchin had been an ugly duckling, abandoned and served up to the branch families as an easy target. Now, the one-armed Davin of the Samyan family had been reborn as the useless Vinchin of the Adenka family. He picked up a diary, leafing through its grim litany of self-criticism. Vinchin had truly been committed to hating himself. His own maids ignored him, his attendants disregarded him, and his relatives saw him as defective. Death, in Vincent's mind, had been the preferable option. Davin found the irony almost comical. In life, Vinchin had wished to die, and now that Davin had wanted so desperately to live, Vinchin's absence made that possible. His musings were interrupted by an unfamiliar voice, challenging him on whether he really intended to believe something so absurd. Turning, he found no one visible. The voice pressed on, wondering aloud whether he was naive or simply foolish. Davin wondered if a demon had taken an interest in misleading him. Perhaps reincarnation had been a clerical error in the afterlife. The voice soon clarified that it belonged to the original owner of the body. This, apparently, was Vinchin, or rather, the soul that once held the name. With casual composure, the figure appeared before Davin and introduced himself as Julian, explaining that the name Vincent no longer belonged to him. Davin asked the obvious question, how could someone dead stand before him? Julian answered with a certain dramatic flair that left little room for doubt. He explained that his original goal had been to summon a spirit god, but had somehow stumbled into becoming one himself, albeit a minor god. To ascend to full godhood, he said, he would need to complete a calling, which required gathering numerous achievements. Davin dismissed this politely but firmly. He had a new life and fully intended to spend it without being roped into some ghost's resume-building project. Julian, unfazed, reminded him that the body they now shared had its survival tied to Julian's spiritual energy. Should that energy run dry, the body would cease to exist. The statement struck Davin as something between a warning and a threat, but before he could retort, a sudden pain sent him collapsing to the ground. Julian remarked with a certain smugness that Davin was naive, then proceeded to flood his mind with Vincent's own memories. What Davin saw was brutal. Vincent had been stepped on, literally and metaphorically, mocked, humiliated, and written off as pitiful. Yet behind the facade of a coward lay careful calculation. The boy had been preparing for revenge all along, using weakness as camouflage. His end, however, had come before his plans could bear fruit. As Davin recovered from the onslaught, Julian asked how convincing his performance was. He claimed it was a necessary plan to escape his family's scrutiny. All he wanted was to study a course, but apparently it was considered as something meant for an apostolic-scaled individual. I guess we'll understand what this means later on in the manhwa. Then came the bait. Julian claimed that their partnership would not be so disadvantageous for Davin either. He asked if Davin had ever heard of the Archdemon Davin and the Hero King Kajin. That name, his own name, paired with Kajin's, sent a ripple of surprise through him. None of it made any sense to him at all. Julian carried on explaining that the story went back 5 centuries. There had been a one-armed swordsman named Davin who escaped from Samyan's prison and, thanks to a pact with a demon, devoured thousands of children to gain strength. History, Julian claimed, recorded him as having killed more than 10,000 people, earning the infamous title of Archdemon Davin. Davin listened just long enough to realize Julian was suggesting this all happened exactly 500 years ago. The implication was almost insulting. What were the odds of 2 people sharing the same name, Davin, alongside a companion named Kajin? His thoughts wandered. Julian pressed on, but Davin barely heard him. He was too busy mulling over the absurdity of it all, weighing the possibility that they might both be tied to the Samyan bloodline. He was certain of one thing. He had died 500 years ago in that wretched prison. The Samyan family had discarded him, the one-armed man, in favor of the storm sword Kajin, who went on to become the Sword Emperor, while Davin rotted away, alone. And now, apparently, history had been dressed up into some grandiose tale involving the Hero King. Davin found the embellishment irritating enough to smash the table in front of him. Julian, unfazed by splinters and temper alike, remarked that the Hero King Kajin had been a true friend to the Archdemon Davin and had valued him deeply. Davin's glare suggested this was precisely the sort of ridiculous fabrication he could live without. He hurled books across the room and demanded that Julian stop spouting such lunacy. Julian looked genuinely puzzled, asking why Davin was angry. Davin's reply was blunt, because the entire historical account was nonsense. Julian then inquired if perhaps Davin himself was from that era. When Davin confirmed the possibility, Julian chuckled about his age and warned him not to take things so personally. History, he said, was merely the sum of stories told by the victors. Davin found it unsettling that a 13-year-old could talk like a jaded historian. Once he'd cooled enough to sit down, Davin asked Julian to continue. Julian described how the Hero King had swallowed his grief and joined the Sun Sword Emperor to defeat the Archdemon Davin. The Sun Sword Emperor, Julian revealed, was Aslan, the very ancestor of the Adenka family. Recognition stirred in Davin. He remembered Aslan as a youth, all enthusiasm and respect, declaring that he admired Davin and wanted to be like him. Back then, Davin had accepted him as both disciple and younger brother, puzzled at what the boy saw in a one-armed man. Even during Davin's imprisonment, Aslan had visited, assuring him that the truth would outlast authority and promising to restore his honor no matter how long it took. Then, without warning, Aslan had stopped visiting. Julian explained that Aslan became the first patriarch of the Adenka family and had left behind a life mission connected to Julian's achievements, surpass the Samian family, and uncover the truth. Davin considered the possibility that this was no coincidence. Aslan had abandoned his old family and created the Adenka line specifically to reclaim lost honor. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of humor, placing Davin in this family now. Davin told Julian that fulfilling this mission would serve both their purposes. Julian confirmed it. If the calling were completed, he would become a true god, and Davin could become the rightful owner of his body, perhaps even receiving an extraordinary blessing in the process. It was, Julian insisted, a mutually beneficial deal. Davin rose, took up the sword before him, and privately thanked Aslan for leaving behind such a task. He would surpass the Samian family, climb above those who had betrayed him, and embrace his place in the Aslan-founded Adenka family. Outside, Julian floated lazily at his side, calling him Old Man. Davin reminded him to stop with that nickname. But Julian argued that 500 years was, by any reasonable standard, old. Davin made a show of forgetting the calling's details. After all, wasn't that what old men did? Julian laughed then, quite suddenly, clasped his arm, and called him brother. Davin admitted that title was far more acceptable. They were interrupted by the clash of swords nearby, guards sparring. Davin's curiosity stirred. He wondered how martial arts had evolved in 5 centuries and whether the descendants of Kajin in the Samian family had grown much stronger. That would be interesting to test. Before he could dwell further, his body betrayed him again, collapsing under its own frailty. Later, Davin pointed out, with the enthusiasm of someone diagnosing a broken cart, that the boy's body was essentially junk. Without mana control, even basic life would be unsustainable. While meditating later, Davin noticed something interesting about the mana flow and summoned Julian back. He asked why Julian had never learned swordsmanship. Julian explained that a disability at birth had prevented it. Davin scoffed, pointing out that Julian had the heavenly exoskeleton, a trait that allowed mana to be stored not just in the heart, but in the very bones. This, he explained with rising irritation, meant endless reserves of power. The sort of gift that could make a martial artist unstoppable. Julian seemed intrigued yet clueless, as if hearing he owned a gold mine but wondering why the dirt was shiny. Davin reminded him that Kajin, the so-called hero king, had also possessed this ability. It was ironic, Davin thought, that fate had returned him to the world with the heavenly exoskeleton, an advantage he had once envied in Kajin. Of course, now that he had it, the world 5 centuries later seemed far stranger than anticipated. Julian's voice broke the moment, insisting that he simply could not link imagery to the heart. The term sounded strange to Davin, who asked what on earth that was. Julian, burying his face into a pillow, as though shielding himself from the stupidity in the air, remarked that explaining this to an old man was a challenge in itself. He went on to clarify that imagery was an imaginary storage for mana. Davin found that absurd, pointing out that mana had always been stored in the heart, and asking what had happened to the old meditation methods. Clearly, the martial arts of this era had taken a different path. Julian explained that these days, mana was stored in imagery, each referred to as a star, and the number of stars determined a martial artist's strength. Physical storage in the body had been abandoned long ago, and, according to him, not even records of it remained. Davin found it astonishing. Adults, it seemed, created their first imagery and filled it with mana to reach the level of 1 star. He suspected this method was devised to avoid the fatal risks of heart storage, a practice that had claimed more than half of the martial artists in his own time. Dangerous, yes, but those who survived became formidable. As Davin drew his sword, Julian's alarm was immediate. The boy demanded to know if mana was currently being collected in the heart. Davin reassured him with the confidence of someone who had survived worse, remarking that a strong heart could take the risk. A proper martial artist, he said, had to live dangerously. Julian was quick to notice another problem. Davin's mana flow was chaotic. There was, Julian insisted, a circuit formula for this. Davin was unimpressed, explaining that in his day, they managed without formulas, though, admittedly, about half died in the process. He seemed to think this a perfectly acceptable survival rate. Julian disagreed, complaining that it was easy for Davin to gamble with someone else's body. Davin then turned the conversation on its head, asking why such a precious body had been left in such poor condition. He pointed out that the heavenly exoskeleton allowed mana to be stored in the bones as well as the heart, but this gift had been left to starve for over 13 years. Without proper training, the body would never reach adulthood. Later that day, Davin meditated, though the limits of time pressed against him. 10 years, he thought, was both too long and far too short, a span sufficient for Stormsword to have risen as Sword Emperor, while a one-armed prisoner like himself faded from memory. His mind wandered back to those final years in prison, where starvation and slow decay had been his only companions. A sharp banging at the door pulled him back. A voice demanded to know what he was doing. A servant entered, horrified at the state of the room. Davin, half rising, asked if he was indeed a servant, to which the man responded that of course he was. What else would he be, the master? The man was Wilson, a name Julian had mentioned before, though Davin dismissed the rest of that memory as irrelevant. Instead, he handed Wilson a pile of clothes and told him to bring fresh ones and clean the mess. Wilson looked him over, surprised to see a strength in him that hadn't been there before. When asked again about the chaos in the room, Davin dismissed any talk of strange experiments. Wilson became agitated, suggesting that isolation had driven him mad, perhaps even toward dark magic. He threatened to report this to the Patriarch. Davin found it amusing that someone could be so formal while saying such impertinent things, reminding Wilson that refusing a direct order from his master was bold indeed. Wilson protested, claiming he was not there to clean up after him. Davin agreed that he could refuse, though in that case he would simply go to the Grand Chamberlain himself and explain that his servant did not wish to work. Wilson, visibly annoyed, snatched the clothes back and muttered that he would handle the cleaning after all. Julian appeared then, whispering that Wilson had once been a gang member who had killed countless people. Davin found that unconvincing. There was no trace of the killing aura in him, only an innocence in his eyes that betrayed inexperience in true bloodshed. Julian seemed doubtful, but Davin merely smiled, claiming he had lived long enough to know the difference. Julian, perhaps wondering what sort of spirit he had summoned, wisely let the matter drop. Wilson entered the room with the enthusiasm of a man determined to prove his worth, loudly calling for the young master. He announced that he had brought the clothes Davin had worn yesterday, freshly washed, and even mentioned how he had cleaned the room. He asked if Davin liked his work. Davin thanked him for the hard effort, though Wilson added, rather unnecessarily, that the room should not be turned into a battlefield next time. Davin replied without offense, which Wilson noted with mild surprise. It seemed, in Wilson's opinion, that the once prickly young master had become slightly more agreeable. Davin then asked Wilson to fetch him a wooden sword, ideally weighing about 500 grams, made of black-scented wood, of which there should be plenty in the family storeroom. Wilson asked what would happen if he refused, prompting Davin to stand and remark that he would then simply go and retrieve it himself. Of course, that would lead to an awkward exchange with the storeroom gatekeepers, who happened to be exceptional martial artists fiercely loyal to the family's direct descendants. Wilson, feeling that the conversation had already turned strange, asked Davin to hold on a moment and even grabbed him by the hand. That, however, prompted a sudden shift in Davin's gaze, followed by Wilson finding himself unceremoniously dropped onto the floor. Davin apologized, explaining that he had unpleasant memories of being attacked from behind. Wilson found this oddly specific and noted that he had never heard of such a thing happening before. Davin, turning away, told him to keep it that way in the future. The effort of the brief scuffle left Davin quietly acknowledging that his body was already screaming in protest. Wilson, standing again, was clearly annoyed, but when Davin asked whether he had something to say, the servant instead repeated the sword specifications, as though to confirm them. Davin teased him by pointing out that he had just refused the task moments ago. Wilson quickly left, making sure to declare that he had never said he would do nothing, though he slammed the door in irritation. A moment later, he reopened it slightly to clarify that the door had closed from the wind, not malice, before shutting it gently. Davin smirked at the display, calling Wilson a little rascal, despite Wilson saying nothing more. In the hall, Wilson muttered to himself that he would not lose to Davin again. He had his pride to defend, after all. When Wilson returned, he held the sword awkwardly, almost as though trying to provoke Davin, secretly enjoying the thought that the young master might not receive it so easily. But Davin, setting aside his book, began speaking of a man he knew who had no right arm and whose life had ended miserably. Wilson, suddenly wary, offered the sword immediately, bowing slightly as he did so. Davin accepted it with thanks, while Wilson thought the whole exchange more embarrassing than it was worth. With the sword in hand, Davin stepped into the courtyard and began training with the scarecrow dummies. His swings quickly revealed the weakness of his heavenly exoskeleton, as his stamina drained far too soon. Still, the exertion felt good to him, almost confirming that he was born to be a martial artist. The peaceful practice ended when someone appeared out of nowhere and sliced the scarecrow cleanly in half. The stranger apologized, claiming that Davin's mana energy was so weak that he had not even noticed anyone standing in front of him. Davin, unimpressed, asked who he was. The man introduced himself as Revan Adenka and immediately remarked that Davin must be that useless Vinchin. Julian appeared just in time to remind Davin that Revan was a collateral descendant and a strong contender in the upcoming Assembly of True Swords. In fact, he was one of the most skilled among the Adenka family's 13-year-olds. Revan admitted that he had sought Davin out, figuring that they might face each other in the competition. The Assembly of True Swords was a gathering of young martial artists from across the world, hosted by the Adenka family, where the victor earned the right to face a direct descendant. Naturally, Vinchin was considered the prime target among those descendants. Revan, with no subtlety at all, told Davin not to hide from him out of fear, because in the assembly, they would not be using wooden swords. Just so we're on the same page, I'll clarify that Davin and Vinchin are the same person. Let's enjoy the story, and remember to leave a like. Davin responded with mild amusement, asking how any martial artist could be afraid of real swords. He also offered the unsolicited opinion that even provocations ought to be delivered with dignity. Inwardly, he found it shameful for someone to ruin another man's scarecrow. Even Kajin, in all his pride, would have respected training grounds. He remarked that he must have gotten this disgusting attitude from his father, having encountered a similar disdain from him not too long ago. Revan took offense when Davin remarked that his manners reflected poorly on his father. In return, Revan pointed his wooden sword at Davin, declaring that he would not forgive such an insult. Julian quietly warned that Revan was a 2-star martial artist with the steel attribute far stronger than Davin in raw ability. Davin, however, found it obvious that Revan's aggression came from an ingrained sense of inferiority common among collateral descendants. The boy had even tried to harm him with mana, knowing full well he could not control it. In Davin's view, martial discipline had declined to a level comparable to that of 5 centuries past. It seemed to him that a lesson was in order. Drawing his sword, Davin leveled it at Revan and commented that in his day, someone like him would have been disciplined by the family elders. Revan, surprised by the confidence of a man without mana or imagery, nevertheless sensed that this was not an opponent to underestimate. The feeling was unsettling enough for him to call for a halt. Though Davin remarked that Raven got scared just because of some wooden sword, he taunted him, saying that in the Assembly of True Swords, the battle would not end with mere wooden swords. Raven, narrow-minded, took the bait and was visibly annoyed. He told him instead that he would kill him here today. With that, Raven dashed forward, sword aimed for a strike. He wasn't about to allow Davin to humiliate him on their first meeting. Comment the words Part 2 down below. And if you got to this point, thanks for watching, friend. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're not already part of the fam. See you on the next one.